All right, everybody, welcome to From the Other Sideline, brought to you by Frogs Today. I'm your host, Melissa Treebwasser. This week, I am joined by a very special guest, somebody that I have been dying to talk to the entire season because he is far and away the most optimistic Kansas fan that I know, and somebody who has believed in this program well before 5-0. So Andy Mitts, welcome to the podcast. You can find Andy at Blue Wings Rising and, of course, the Rock Chalk Pod. For those of you guys, we just actually recorded his podcast right before this, and so we've spent a lot of quality time together tonight and would have it no other way. Andy,
of course not.
5-0. Tell me how you're feeling, my friend.
Oh, it's fantastic. Look, I was not convinced that they would get 5-0, but I did, we were actually talking about this over on mine. Like, I had them going bowling this year. And mainly because, well, actually we can thank our good friend Philip Slavin over on the 10-12 podcast for that, because he wanted bold predictions. And I had just gotten a successful, Kansas beating Texas down in Austin prediction, just shortly before that. And so I was like, you know what? I think this team's going to be better. I think that there's a chance that they could be a lot better. I'm going to go ahead and predict them going to a bowl game by beating K-State at the end of the year to go 6-6. And, I got a lot of flack for it. And so, of course, I did what I always do. I hunkered down and doubled down on it and said, you know what, I don't care. Like, I could be wrong and I'll deal with it if I'm wrong. But, I think this is a very real possibility. And now, of course, everyone's like, he must have seen something. And I mean, I think I did, like, seeing Jalen Daniels, seeing the improvement that this team had. There was a lot of questions, right, about how realistic was it that the improvement we saw in the last 3 games last season was going to carry over. And the way that they talked about what Leipold was doing, the way that Leipold talked about this team and talked about the development they had over the course of the season, and the fact that they had only, he'd only been on campus since April 30th of last year. So they didn't have spring practices. They literally, like, by the time you were getting to that Texas game, and the Oklahoma game a couple weeks before, like, that was the time that you normally would have gotten through all the practices you would normally get from camp, having had a spring. And so, you could tell that there was some difference. And then when Jalen Daniels came in, the fact that, like, everybody just assumed that he was going to be the starter coming into this year. And he had some things to prove. It actually sounds like, based off of camp interviews and things like that, like, Jason Bean was a lot closer to actually winning the starting job than I think a lot of people thought was even possible. But Daniels was able to go ahead and get it turned on, and we've seen the results from that. They have a lot of different guys. And I think the biggest unsung hero for what they're doing right now is just the fact that this team is like a well-oiled machine enough that the coaches don't even necessarily have to do all the coaching. Like, half the time the players are coaching each other while they're out on the field. It makes it a whole lot easier when you're trying to run something, if everybody knows exactly what it is and you don't have to do very much. Like, this has been a much easier time, I think, for them this year, because everybody knows what's going on. Everybody is, all kind of in the same lane and doing all of the same sort of things. It's a lot easier, I think, for them this year, because they don't have to have nearly as many people learning about what they're trying to do. They just have a bunch of people that already know, because they've been in the system for over a year.
I mean, you brought up Leipold and just how little time he's actually been in Lawrence. A bold prediction was bowling this year. How ahead of schedule is Lance Leipold and this Kansas program right now? Oh
gosh, they're way ahead of schedule. Like, it's I was talking with a bunch of other people, Kansas alums in media, and I think the general consensus that we had was that if he can get them to 5 wins by year 4, so, like, not this year, not next year, but the year after, get the 5 wins, you have to think that that's a successful rebuild. The fact that they're already at 5 wins, in year 2, 5 games into the season, like, they're undoubtedly ahead of schedule. And it's not like it was, fluky wins where guys got injured or a whole bunch of, like, this is a good team that has played some decent competition and has at times been completely dominant. So it's definitely way ahead of schedule, I think, of what anybody was expecting. But I do also think that a lot of that has to do with people getting their hopes up so many times with guys like Les Miles, with David Beatty, with, Charlie Weiss, like, guys that you thought could do what the program needed. And it turns out behind the scenes, they weren't really building the foundation that they needed to. Lance Leipold came in and talked about the foundation immediately. And you knew immediately he was going to build the foundation. And he was upfront and honest with everybody, like, hey, this could be a very painful 4 years, but we need to build this foundation to build off of and get everybody ready to go. Luckily, everybody bought in, staff, athletic department, all the players, all the coaching staff, everything. Like, they got them all together, and it worked well enough, soon enough, that we were able to see this huge head start. But I mean, I think everybody was prepared for this to be, a 4 or 5 year process just to get back to potential bowl eligibility.
Well, normally I think that you start a season, you start talking about tempering your expectations because you go 2-2 out the gate, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh,
Right.
maybe I thought, well, you're in the opposite position. Like, how do Kansas fans not get too excited about what's happening? And like, what's a realistic, we were joking about, rematching the Big 12 title game, but realistically, like, take off your blue blinders and tell me what's a realistic expectation for Kansas this season? Like, how good do you think that they can be?
It's funny because you look around the rest of the Big 12, like normally I would have said, you have this game against TCU, and then you hit the murderer's row of Oklahoma, like at Oklahoma, at Baylor, and then Oklahoma State at home. The way that this team has been playing at home, I don't know that Oklahoma State game is definitely a loss. Like, I would probably still pick Oklahoma State if we started today, but I could definitely see them winning. I could see a path to them, being potentially even a favorite in that game, depending on how things happen before that. But Baylor has looked very vulnerable at times. They have some issues with their quarterback not gelling the way that they would expect. Oklahoma's had all kinds of problems, as you are well aware, because of what TCU did to them. So like, I watched that Kansas State versus Oklahoma and that TCU versus Oklahoma, and I was like salivating. I'm like, oh my gosh, Jalen Daniels is going to have so much fun in this particular game, because I don't think Oklahoma's going to be able to stop him a single bit. So like, I think that, that is a game that you look at now that all of a sudden is winnable down in Norman. And that is the strangest feeling, to like feel like you're going into that game that you should win that game because of how bad Oklahoma has been. So, theoretically, like if we're just being like, I think conservatively, Kansas wins at least 3 more games. So like 8-4 feels like the floor to me for this team. And that's if,
Wow.
Stuff doesn't go well. Because they just have so many options. They have so many talent, so many talented guys. They're really good. And I think the one thing that goes undersold about this team is that they are very adaptable in the game. They have twice this year gone down 14-0 in the first quarter, and both times have come back to have huge scoring runs after that. Against Houston, they got down 14-0, 5 minutes or 7 minutes left in the first quarter. So 8 minutes into the game, immediately went on a 42-7 run to take a gigantic lead and win that game by 18 points. Like, that is not something that a Kansas team normally is able to do. Normally, if they get behind by 2 scores, it's kind of like, well, how bad can we, like, can we just keep it from being a 5-score margin? So this is a team that has a lot of confidence. They have a lot of stuff that's happening, that is going their way. A lot of the lucky breaks that would go for the other team in prior years seem to be going for the Jayhawks this year. So it feels like this is a team that, for whatever reason, is like cashing in all of its chips that they've accumulated over the, awful decade and a half that we've had, coming into this season. So I'm just kind of hoping, I am not as crazy as Richard Johnson over at SI.com, who is predicting Kansas to go to the Sugar Bowl to play Alabama. So like, I'm not that far yet.
Richard. Yes,
yeah, I know. It's
certainly.
Great. Yeah, I'm not there yet. If they start 9-0 though, it's going to be kind of hard not to go there.
Yeah. I think one of the great things about a quick turnaround is obviously the fruits of your spoils, right? The quick turnaround. But the other thing that happens when a program starts overachieving with a new hot, fresh coach is everybody starts talking about when he's leaving. And, you just played Iowa State. Nobody can relate more than that to that than the Cyclones, where Matt Campbell used to be the guy that was getting mentioned for all of these Nebraska jobs in Wisconsin.
He still is getting mentioned.
I don't think he is anymore. I think that now Matt Campbell is like down to 4th place because Lance Leipold is the guy.
Yeah, that's true.
And so Matt Campbell used to be the next guy. But like, frankly, if you look at what they came into expectation wise a season ago and how they performed, and I mean, not all that's in their control, and they don't really look like a great team this year. Lance Leipold has done what nobody ever believed could be done, and he's turned Kansas around, and he's done it very, very quickly. And a guy that's got some ties to some of these open positions. What point, as a Kansas fan, do you start thinking, oh no, he's been too good too fast, versus at what point do you just kind of enjoy the ride and hope for the best?
Well, I mean, it's both right now. Like that's really what it is. The thing that gives me hope though is, one, Leipold is a guy who does not just willy-nilly, up and move from one job to another. He was at Wisconsin Whitewater for so long. He was at Buffalo, and he didn't stay at Buffalo as long as I would have expected him to, the way that he talks about things. But one of his biggest quotes was, look, I left Buffalo when I felt like they were in a strong enough position to continue the momentum moving forward and continue to grow as a program. And he didn't feel like there was anything else that he could do out like his ability to bring stability to a program and to build that consistency, that he was basically done there and he needed a new challenge. And that's why he decided to come to Kansas. And apparently he wanted that job. He wanted the Kansas job. He was the guy that was being talked about for the Kansas job when Les Miles got hired. Unfortunately, we found out that Jeff Long only wanted Les Miles and only centered in on Les Miles. And, we had to deal with all of that fun stuff. But, Leipold is the guy, along with a guy like Jeff Monken, right, who have wanted to have Power 5 jobs in a good situation. And Kansas was a super attractive job to them because of the ability to rebuild the program and to be able to do that sort of stuff. I don't know that Leipold would look at going to like a Wisconsin or going to a Nebraska as leaving this in the kind of position that he wants to be able to say that he was successful here. And so it's one of those things where like, I could understand if he goes, like if he wanted the money, if he wanted to go back home, I would understand it. I wouldn't necessarily like it because obviously he wouldn't be here anymore, but I would completely understand it and I would wish him well. I just don't know, give the way that he's talking about things, the way he's talking about planning groups, the way that they talk about the fans and the administration and everything here, there is a lot to be said for top to bottom organizational synergy. This AD, and the way he works with all of the coaches that he has in his athletic department, like they all rave about him. Bill Self raves about what Travis Goff does. Travis Goff and Lance Leipold talk about each other in such glowing terms that I have a hard time imagining that it's not a real, connection that they have in terms of the way that they're doing their jobs. And so much like Matt Campbell has over time resisted multiple, rumors and multiple potential openings because he just likes the situation where he's at, I think that that's a real possibility for Leipold. Now, I'm not going to say there's no way he's leaving, because I'm going to tell you, if someone was going to offer me, 4 times as much as I'm making right now to go work for them and it's close to home, like I would definitely consider it. But I can see a path where he would be willing to stay, where he would determine that his work here is not finished and that they love the area enough, with that kind of great situation that he's in, that they would want to stick around.
I mean, I'll tell you, right, from an outsider's perspective, if he quit tomorrow and he had gotten Kansas to 5-0, everybody else in college football is going to be like, that dude's the best coach in history. So,
oh yeah, of course.
I mean,
he's almost at this point already wrapped up coach of the year. Like it's that ridiculous.
Yeah, he's been unbelievable. It's so funny to me because I think we all say the same things when we get a coach that kind of starts out a little bit hotter than we thought, and then one of these big name jobs come open that we know that they have some type of ties. Oh, we've got the organizational structure, but the situation, we all are just trying to talk ourselves into the same things, but it doesn't mean it's not true either. So, and I think you're right.
I think the other thing is that we have, as we've gotten more and more, there's more exposure, to all the different programs. A lot of programs are throwing a lot more money at their coaching positions now. Like, it's not a case usually where like a Nebraska can swoop in with 5 times the amount of money. Oh, and your teams can be, that, and your teams can be on national television, 3 times as often as some of these other places. So, no, everything is on streaming now. Like everything, you can find it if you really want to find it. So it's not like you're not going to have the exposure that you want. And so I think it's just a lot harder for some of those schools that are used to being able to throw their money and their exposure around as huge pluses to not have as big of an advantage now anymore. Plus, I think that Nebraska fans are completely unreasonable. And I think that a lot of people know that. And that's why they have a hard time getting a good coach, because a lot of the good coaches don't want to deal with it. And Wisconsin, I think, is kind of somewhat to the same sort of thing. I've also heard that Wisconsin is really like, I almost think that they made that move to make sure that their defensive coordinator didn't get grabbed by someone like Nebraska. So yeah, that's part of the reason I'm not necessarily so concerned, because I don't think that Leipold is the number 1 on any of those lists. He's probably a 3 or 4 at best, which means that it's going to take a lot of other stuff to happen before he actually gets the call, which means I don't have to worry about it for this year. Like, it's probably not going to happen before the year's over. So,
well, and I think too, we're going to see a lot of how these things shake out with realignment. And if the Big Ten and the SEC, ultimately end up in their super conference or whatever, then the rest of us we're never going to be able to beat that. But if the Big 12 can solidify, and I think the addition of the 4 teams they're bringing in are really strong. And, let's just be honest, Texas and Oklahoma are holding us back at this point. So
exactly.
I want to get into the on the field stuff. And you talked about Jalen Daniels and Jason Bean, and I want to do that. There was a absolutely fantastic profile in the LA Times on Jalen Daniels, and him and his mom, their relationship, the way that he kind of matriculated through high school, looking for opportunities, working with the QB coach to finally get that third star, and just the work that he put in and the time that he put in, the focus he had on getting an opportunity like this. When they went and got Jason Bean, who was a fairly well decorated quarterback out of UNT, I think that everybody outside thought that he was going to be the guy, people that weren't around the program. What is it about Jalen Daniels? What has he done to not just earn this position, but to kind of vault himself into the national conversation now that he owns it?
Well, it's funny because there's a lot of people that talk about, oh, well, Leipold went and got Jason Bean. And that's actually not the case. Like, Jason Bean was one of the last recruits that signed on, under Les Miles, it wasn't Brent Dearman at the time. It was, I forget who the guy was that took over, because he didn't even actually coach a game for them. So, but it was under the previous regime. And so they knew coming in, and Jalen Daniels knew coming into that year that he had an opportunity with a brand new coach to kind of figure things out. It is one of those things though, I think Daniels coming as early as he did, because, he was 17. He didn't turn 18 until I think it was 3 weeks before the end of the season or something like that. His freshman year or somewhere. Yeah. It was during the season though, that he turned 18, because they made a big deal about it, in the actual broadcast, for 4 weeks in a row before he did turn. And then after he turned, it was just okay, fine, whatever. But no, it was like those bingo card things, right? Where it's you check off all the things, they're absolutely going to talk about. But so, he has always kind of been behind people, or, had to figure out how to distinguish himself from everyone else. And, Brent Dearman gave him a lot of confidence. Brent Dearman was the one who found him, was really stumping for him to be able to come. And when Brent Dearman took over the offense, that's when they really got the opportunity to go ahead and get him and get him started and get everything going. So he had the opportunity to come in that 2020 season and really, kind of learn on the fly and do things that completely unexpected. The problem, of course, was the fact that the offensive line wasn't any good at all. And so he really didn't have an opportunity to show. And I actually have heard an interview or so where, there's definitely some thoughts that might have shaken some of his confidence, made it more difficult for him to get the starting job coming out of the first year. But it was one of those things, when Leipold came in, the way he was talking, he wanted a guy who had a very consistent floor. Jalen Daniels, I think a lot of people were talking about him as the most talented and the highest ceiling player, but definitely was not the most consistent. And so really what it came down to was he had to prove that he could be that consistent type of guy. He had the opportunity to do that. He was getting ready to crack the depth chart before Bean and Miles Kendrick got hurt. But the fact that they both got hurt in that Kansas State game gave him an opportunity to actually get in there and show what he can do. And of course, we all know what happened against Texas the next week. So it's one of those things. He has continually made himself ready so that when he gets the opportunity, he can jump on it. And even though it hasn't always been successful, he's always ready to keep going. And he's done really well at absorbing, I think, a lot of the information of what's coming out around him. Just hearing him talk in the press conferences afterwards, the love that he has for the game, how excited he is to be able to be there, and then to be talking with the press and learning, or sharing everything that he's learned and all the great experiences he's having. I think about it like my kids, when they first came home, from the first day of kindergarten, they wanted to tell me absolutely every single thing that happened because they were just that excited about it. And that's the feeling you get from him. So when he's that locked in and that engaged, it's no wonder that he's picking stuff up that quickly and is, has all that energy out on the field, because you can just tell that this is what he wants to do. And he loves the opportunity to be able to do it at a place where a lot of people aren't expecting it from him.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a great story. He seems like a fantastic human being and super talented to boot. And it's, much like Max Duggan, we were talking about, on your show, it's that watching these guys who put in the work, who put in the time, who want to be great and fight to get those opportunities, turn it around and have success is, as a college football fan, you have to be happy for guys like that. They do all the right things, and they see that opportunity. When you look at the rest of the offense outside of Daniels, is there one area, based on what you've seen out of TCU, or you can't even say historically TCU is a completely different program this year, but where you think that Kansas really has an advantage, or something that you think that they can do that's been really successful against their previous opponents?
So I think the biggest thing, and this is something that they've talked about all through fall camp, was the depth that they had on this team. They hit the transfer portal really hard, because last year, the big issue that they had was they had some pretty good starters, guys who were definitely Big 12 caliber players who could see significant time on pretty much any Big 12 squad, but they did not have the backups that were either physical enough or talented enough or had the right, just physical profile to be Big 12 caliber players consistently. And so there was a lot of times where they would start out, in first, second quarter, maybe even sometimes into the third quarter, that they would be doing okay. They'd be hanging into games that, it wouldn't be an absolute bloodbath yet. And then they would just wear out, because you can't play the same 11 guys on defense every single snap. It's just not possible with the way that these offenses are this year, or these, this now with the way the football is. And so they ran into a lot of issues of just not having quality depth. They went out, hit the transfer portal, essentially brought in an entire brand new starting lineup from the transfer portal, so that they now had a 2 deep that was guys that were all at that same level. And what you've seen now is that when they rotate guys in, they're not taking a huge downgrade. There are a bunch of guys that are all fighting. It's funny because I made a joke the other day that the most commonly used word from this Kansas football team is the word "or," because of how many times you see "or" on the depth chart. Because they just have so many, like they have 4 running backs listed as the starter. It's like Devin Neal or Daniel Highshaw or Kai Thomas or Sevion Morrison. Like all of them are technically starters according to the depth chart. So like they have a bunch of guys that do that. And even on the defensive side, you have so many different guys that they would be comfortable with either of them starting. It's just a matter of, which, like the official starter is whoever happens to be in whatever package is out there on the first play. And so, that's the other thing too, though, is that they talk about the way that practice has been set up, the way that they have built this team and the attitude of this team, that it's not about individual players. Like if an individual player plays well, they're going to get the stats, they're going to get the recognition that comes with it. But the best way to do that is to set it up so that way the team is being successful, because nobody's going to care about an individual player if their team that they play for is crap.
Yeah.
And so really what it comes down to is, playing in this squad, especially on the defensive side, that you're not playing 75% of the snaps. You're probably playing somewhere between 40 and 55, just kind of depending on who you are. But what that allows them to do is they can play harder, they can play faster, they can go all out when they're actually on the field, because they know that, 3 or 4 plays, they're coming off the field and getting a break for a little while so that the next guy can go in and do the same sort of thing. And that sort of depth that they have, especially along the defensive line, has really worn down a lot of teams. You saw a Houston team just wear down, starting in the second quarter, and Kansas ran all over them and did pretty much whatever they wanted. West Virginia, they wore down over the course of the game, and so that Kansas was super successful. And I think that's really what this team is all about. Even if they get down to get down early, they are consistent enough. They're able to do the same thing over the course of the entire game, that they know that, no matter what deficit they find themselves at, they have an offense that's explosive enough and a defense that is consistent enough that they can come back from that deficit as long as they start doing what they need to do. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing, is just that they have so much defensive depth, especially along the defensive line, that really helps them out and really helps to wear down the opponent. And that's where opponents typically start to make mistakes, is when you get into the fourth quarter and your offensive line is tired and they're not blocking very well. And all of a sudden you have a free rusher coming in your quarterback's face, and he's got to bail. And he's just got to get rid of it. That's when the mistakes happen. That's when Kansas capitalizes. And that's how they've been able to close out games this year, by getting huge defensive stops, even if they're giving up tons of yards, early in the game.
So you bring up the defense and kind of just the propensity to give up yards. You talk about, Houston, who I think came in the season, thought was going to be pretty good, but it's kind of, and maybe Kansas broke them. It's very possible.
Yeah.
or West Virginia, whose offense is kind of a hot mess too. I think TCU, inarguably, possibly, is probably the best set of offensive skill players that Kansas has had to face so far this year. And I think their team speed, I think TCU fans knew that there was going to be a pretty fast group here, but the team speed overall, especially at the wide receiver position, has been really, really exceptional. Do you think that there's a place that you're concerned about in the passing game, specifically with Kansas being able to defend, the monsters on the outside, Savion Williams, Quentin Johnston, or dealing with some of those slot receivers, in some of those kind of medium to short routes too, that they're running, where maybe TCU can break a couple big plays or soften that defense up and take the pass rush out from being such a major factor?
So I think what's probably going to end up happening, because this has happened quite a bit for them, is that TCU is going to get off to a hot start, because most teams have. I would not be shocked to see TCU get, 3 or 4 30 to 40 yard plays in the first quarter, just because Kansas tends to give those up. But what they then do is adjust and figure out where they're going to be. The safeties find better spacing. as they are able to see in game what the opponent is trying to do, they shift stuff around. So I definitely think that there are going to be times where TCU is going to be successful, and if they can vary up the attack that they have, then that could potentially be a problem. Because Kansas doesn't necessarily adjust fast enough. I am definitely worried about speed on the outside. That has been a problem at times. I am definitely worried about the ability of running backs to go out on really quick sweeps. Especially if Kansas bites on a fake going the other direction. The thing is, though, like a lot of it is stuff. A lot of the things that are good at attacking this Kansas defense are things that they're seeing the offense do all the time. And so they've been getting better week after week. But I don't think that they have played, as you said, a team that is as fast across the board as TCU. They've definitely played some pretty fast players. They've definitely played some quarterbacks that can run pretty well. But I don't think that they have seen the entire package of what TCU has. So I think what's going to be important here is for them to take away as much as they possibly can, focus on a couple things, and then just set themselves up to be able to fight back with their own successful offense, to basically at least outscore whatever TCU is able to do. I have no illusions that they're going to be able to stop TCU completely. But what's really going to matter, I think, is how well TCU is able to change it up throughout the game. Because if you get into the fourth quarter and Kansas is within a score, it's going to be difficult to get any additional points at that point, because that's when the Kansas defense really clamps down. That's when the pass rushers really start to get through, and that's when the sacks start to pile up.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen out of TCU so far this season is they get out to those hot starts. They attack early. Against SMU, they lost all their momentum in the second half. Against Oklahoma, there were a lot of other factors, obviously, with the injury to Dylan Gabriel and the really terrifying, neck injury to Damon Harmon. And so the tenure of that game really changed in the second half. But once they kind of took their foot off the brakes, it was hard to tell their adjustments. And so I think that'll be the chess match I'm looking forward to seeing, is after halftime, how does the Kansas defense adjust against the TCU offense, and can Garrett Riley and Sonny Dykes kind of push the right buttons? Because I think you're going to have to keep your foot on the gas for 4 quarters if you're going to win this game on Saturday. One of the matchups I'm really interested in seeing is Quentin Johnson came into the season with so much hype and a first-round pick, and he's got all the measurables. He hasn't really done a whole lot this season. And I think we're all kind of waiting with bated breath for his breakout game. He's a 6'4" guy that runs probably in the 4.4s, and really, knows how to go up and attack a ball. Is that going to be a bad matchup for Kansas, or have you seen enough success against bigger wide receivers that you think they'll be able to continue to contain him as he has been most of the season?
I think it depends on who's on him. I get the feeling that Kobe Bryant is probably going to be the guy that's with him most of the game. He has shown some success to be able to contest a lot of throws to bigger wide receivers. And some incredible, vertical skills to be able to jump up and actually get stuff. I'll be interested to see there, but I also think that they're going to use guys like Craig Young and Kenny Logan to cheat over and kind of help a little bit. What Kansas has typically been able to do against big passes is come in and lay huge hits. So even if they give up, 10 yards on a play, Craig Young will lay that person out and make them think twice about going up to catch the next one. So they have been very successful, I think, about wearing teams down and making them less successful by making them second guess what's happening and thinking about where stuff's going to happen, or, where things are going to come from. They have been really good, though, as well, about hiding blitzes, about where they're coming from, if they even bring them. They don't typically blitz a lot, though, because the defensive linemen have been so good about getting through. Lonnie Phelps has gotten to the point where, it's a running joke that if you can find a play where he is not being held, then obviously you're like, missing something, because he's literally getting held all the time. So he is a fantastic player, and the motor that he has, I think, rivals what Kyron Johnson had last year, which is saying something because of, how well Kyron Johnson played. And so, to have a guy like that to be able to step in, but then also the development of guys like Malcolm Lee and Caleb Sampson, along the line, and a bunch of just other guys that have really kind of stepped up and moved around. They just have so many different options. Like I would never have thought a guy like Jeremy Robinson or Hayden Hatcher or Sam Burt would have had huge, impacts, but they are routinely in the backfield, routinely making things difficult. And I think the biggest thing is that when Kansas rushes with the pass rush, it's typically coming from all directions. Like they've been really good about containing the outside and then pushing in from the middle. And it's made it really difficult for a lot of quarterbacks to really find somewhere to go. So I think that's what I'm looking for from this Kansas defense. Are they going to be able to get the pressure on Max Duggan? Because their most successful weapon against the pass, especially late in games, has been just not giving quarterbacks very much time to actually make a decision.
Before we get to your prediction and how you expect this game to go, I just have to ask you, I was a long suffering TCU fan for a really long time. My freshman year of college, we were 1-10. We got pepper sprayed on the field, taking down the goalpost because we beat SMU, which was also a terrible program at that point in the 90s. And so, I know what watching the turnaround of TCU meant to me. Like, I bawled like a baby at the Rose Bowl because I just never would have envisioned this kind of scenario. And Kansas is, just in the early steps, but game day coming to Lawrence is such a big deal. Like, I remember the first time TCU got game day, like that kind of gives you the feeling of a fan of like, oh no, this is real. Like, we matter in college football. Can you just tell us a little bit about, as a long suffering Kansas fan, like what does this weekend mean to you?
Well, look, okay. So I am a Kansas City Royals fan, and I suffered through all of that in the 2000s. I am a Kansas City Chiefs fan. I suffered through all of that in the 2000s as well. And I would have to say that I think that this weekend and this turnaround from this team is probably as big a deal, or even more of a big deal, than the Royals winning the World Series and the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl, because just how far they've come in the short amount of time. Like, you saw that Royals team building, right? You saw them do it the year before and then come back and actually have a good team. And you saw the pieces that they pulled together. Same with the Chiefs. Like, you saw them draft Patrick Mahomes, and you got the early returns, and you saw that they were pretty good, and Andy Reid and all of that. This came out of nowhere. Like, we all thought he could get us back there eventually. I was fully prepared for it to take 5 or 6 years to get back to the point where they're consistently, competing for bowl games and looking at winning seasons and all of that stuff. And this has just been absolutely fantastic. So to go from being, the laughing stock, the consistent bottom 10, like fighting for that worst spot in the bottom 10 over on ESPN or something like that, to now everybody is legitimately talking about them having a Coach of the Year candidate and a Heisman candidate, and being one of the best stories of college football. Like, it's nice to be able to actually talk about how good I think this team is without everybody laughing at me for it. Because it's one of those things where, I am definitely an optimist, someone who looks for the best, but Kansas has not been completely bereft of talent. The problem has always been that the support they're getting from the athletic director has not been very helpful for the football program, and the guys they brought in have not been very good at utilizing the guys they have. Kansas has actually brought in a decent number of recruits. David Beatty had some of the highest rated recruiting classes that Kansas has ever seen. Brought in the highest rated recruit that Kansas ever got. He just didn't know what to do with them once they were here. Same with Les Miles. Les Miles brought in a lot of recruits. He brought in most of the team, like most of the core, team that we have here, but he didn't know what to do with them once they were on the field. And so bringing in a guy like Lance Leipold, who knew what to do with these guys and knew how to stabilize this, and then really seeing what Travis Goff has brought to the athletic department, it is a fantastic time to be a Jayhawk fan. It is a complete turnaround from everything that we've expected, because, I'm used to guys like the last competent athletic director that I remember having I was back in high school when Al Bowl was the athletic director for Kansas, and that was forever ago. So yeah, this has been a long time coming. It's great to actually be able to talk about my, Kansas Jayhawk football team and not get laughed at for wanting to be in the conversation. So yeah, it's fantastic. And I still am trying to make sure that this is actually real. So
it's real, Andy. All right. Well, everything's on the line on Saturday. The winner of this game takes pole position early in the season for leading the Big 12. Both teams get to play Oklahoma State pretty quickly after this one too. So it's really going to be a big shake-up opportunity and a way to kind of assert your dominance. How do you see Saturday's game playing out? And what's your score prediction?
Well, first of all, I do appreciate the fact that you're just assuming that Iowa State is going to beat Kansas State for us, so that way they're not undefeated after this week.
Oh, I keep forgetting. Well, they lost to Tulane.
Yeah,
right?
They lost to Tulane, so they're not undefeated.
Talk to me when you've won like 4 Big 12 games. If they're 4-0 in Big 12, we'll talk.
Right. But no, I mean, this is a game that I think is going to be kind of like you were talking about, completely up and down. I would not be shocked to see Kansas drop, get down early in this game, because they have had a tendency to start slow. But the last 2 games that they were, here at home, they actually came out and looked pretty good to start. They didn't necessarily score against Iowa State very much, but they definitely looked a lot crisper. The defense was playing a lot better. I do think that this is a team that has a real home field advantage for the first time in forever. The energy that they have, you can tell that the players feed off the energy from the crowd. And so I do think that Kansas is going to be extremely successful in this one. I do not think that Jalen Daniels is going to have another off day. And it's very easy for me to point to just say that, hey, Daniels had a bad game against Iowa State, and most of that was him. It wasn't receivers. It wasn't, most of the other stuff. It was just Daniels not executing, which is going to happen occasionally. But as we usually see, the good quarterbacks, they'll have one bad game and then they bounce back and play really well after that. So that's what I'm expecting from Jalen Daniels. I'm expecting the Kansas defense to feed off of the energy from game day. This team loves to get hyped. They really do feed off of all the entire environment. They did it even on the road as well, feeding off of the negative energy from the opposing team and using that to their advantage. So I will be interested to see how quickly they build a lead. But this is not a Kansas team, I think, that can handle TCU for the entire game. So I do think that TCU is going to be very competitive in this one. Ultimately, though, I think I have to agree with what you said over on my podcast. I think this is going to be a high-scoring game, and it's going to be a very close game. And ultimately, I think Kansas pulls it out. I'm going to go with something like 42-35 Kansas.
42-30, so giving them a touchdown advantage. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a ton of fun.
Yeah.
11 a.m. kickoff. It's going to have, a lot of eyeballs watching this one. The game day lead-in is always such a big deal.
Even though it's on a different channel.
It's still,
I get the feeling. I actually was talking to somebody. I feel like this might be one of the highest rating FS1 games ever because of how much, intrigue there is with both TCU and Kansas. It's just funny that the Red River rivalry is over on ABC and this is over on FS1, and all anybody's talking about is wanting to watch this game instead of that one.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. Andy, thank you so much for your time. Tell us where people can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me every Monday recapping everything in the Big 12 over on the 10-12 podcast with our good friend Philip Slavin and then Jamie Steyer. You can find me personally on Twitter at AndyMitz12. That's the number 12. And then you can find the podcast wherever you get your podcast, just Rock Chalk Podcast on Twitter at Rock Chalk Pod. And of course, I cover Kansas all the time over on the SI Fan Nation site covering the Jayhawks, which is bluewingsrising.com.
It's awesome. Lots of great things. You're going to want to follow Andy on Saturday, especially during the game day. And I have a feeling that I've had my eyes well up watching game day at TCU before. So you'll be there. So you might get a little bit emotional too. It's a pretty special experience. Couldn't be happier for you. So thank you again for your time. Looking forward to what is inarguably the game of the weekend between TCU and Kansas, a ranked matchup for first place in the Big 12. I know there's some other teams there. We don't care about them. So thank you so much, Andy.
And you know what? We'll just have to do this again before the Big 12 championship.
For the Big 12 championship rematch.